everyone. I'm Maureen Droney with Recording Academy Producers and Engineers Wing, welcoming you to another episode of Inside the Mix, which today is part 3 of our series on Sony 360 RA Immersive Audio. And with us today from Sony are Gus Skinas, Michael Catandella, and Steve Dewey. Michael Catandella is Senior Director of Media Production Operations at Sony Music Entertainment. He's been with Sony for a long time, beginning at its legendary music studios on West 54th Street in New York City as a general assistant, and then later managing the mix rooms and the mastering department there. Mike now manages the Global Media Production Group, which is responsible for all media assets traversing the Sony supply chain. Steve Dewey is the Senior Audio Engineer for Sony's Global Media Production Group. Steve got his start in audio at age 18, sweeping floors at various tracking and mix facilities in Brooklyn and Manhattan, and then working his way up to assistant and then engineering before pivoting to mastering work at Georgetown Masters in Nashville. In 2016, Steve joined Sony Music. As a senior engineer there, he has been instrumental in developing Sony Music's ability to release in all immersive formats, keeping up with changing delivery specs and developing workflows for 360 RA, of course, but also Dolby Atmos and more. Today, his work ranges from immersive mixing to stereo mastering to technical coordination for immersive and stereo release, all with Sony's affiliate labels, Columbia, RCA, Epic, etc. Some of Steve's recent immersive mix credits include Christina Aguilera and London Grammar. Returning today with us is Gus Skinas, who many of you may know, and who is technical support lead on the Sony 360 team. Gus also collaborates with Audio Futures in the development and support of the Walk Mix Creator Sony 360 production tools. Moderating today, as he has previously for this Inside the Mix immersive audio series, is Best Immersive Album Grammy Award-winning engineer, Michael Romanowski. Now, remember, we look forward to your questions. So we really are doing this so that we can hear from you and ask some good questions. So put them in the Q&A. So let's go. Michael, take it away. Michael Romo, take it away.
Thanks, Maureen. Appreciate that. Yeah, with another Michael on the call, on the seminar, making sure we're straight. Thanks for that, and thanks again for having us, and thanks again for this for the P&E wing following through and doing this series to present to our members. Today we're going to get into a deep dive about Sony 360. We're going to talk about the as mentioned, get into deliverables. You know, working in the format is one thing, getting references and deliverables out. What is it? How is it? Who gets them? Who does what? All of that we're going to dig into today. So let's bring on our esteemed panelists or presenters, Gus, Michael, and Steven. Guys, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Hey, everyone.
You're welcome. Gus, I think I think you're going to kick this off, correct?
Well, first, let me say I am thrilled to have Mike Catandella and Steven Dewey on with us because they're the people that you're going to send the deliverables to. And, you know, they can answer a lot of questions and help me as well with the presentation. So, all right.
It's an honor to have both you guys here. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's see.
And I guess as you're pulling that up, I'll just remind folks again, as Maureen did, but Q&A please use not the chat, but the Q&A. We will get to questions whenever you have them. If you want to get them up, we will get them wherever they're appropriate to get in, and there will be a Q&A section at the end. So when we get to through the presentation, somewhere around the 30-minute mark or so, we'll get into questions and answers. So welcome everybody. And if I had a baton, Gus, I'd hand it to the screen to you.
All right. So we've already had 2 sessions, and we discussed in detail the setting up of WalkMix, the mixing process. We touched on deliverables, but we didn't get really deep into it. So we're going to recover the ground of deliverables, and there's quite a bit that you can do when you're making deliverables that can tweak for a better experience, and we'll talk about some of those. But the first thing, let me see, how do I do this? Oops. the first thing to understand is what's the format? What actually gets to the consumer's smart device or smartphone, smart speakers. So 360, the deliverables would get out to the world 4 MPEG-H files. The first one has a average bit rate of 320 kilobits per second, and it can have 5 objects, or we can call them streams. The second one, average bit rate of 640 or 10 objects. Third one, 1024 kilobits per second and 16 objects. And the fourth, 24 objects at 1536 kilobits. But these are maximum objects. Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but even at level 3, if you were delivering a surround 5.0, would it benefit from the 1536 kilobits? Mike?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, yes, it would.
Thank you. Thank you.
was easy.
So
not necessarily an object number, but in resolution.
in resolution,
Correct.
right?
Yeah, the more objects. I mean, if you go to max objects, you're gonna see a little bit lower resolution across those objects. So, yeah.
And in this example, our mix is 61 objects. So we have to get down to those smaller number of objects, and that process is called the pre-render process. Now, the streams that come to the smartphone, to the smart speaker, some of, like in the case of the 24 objects, some of those are actually objects, and some of those make up a static object bed in which all these other things that can't fit into the 24 can be rendered in. So let's move on. The first thing let's talk about is, okay, in most workstations, the workstation itself creates the deliverables, but here it's not the case. WalkMix, it's kind of like a workstation in a workstation. So it has to have things in place in order to have what it needs to generate the deliverables. And there's several things that when you're ready to create the deliverables, you have to go through this checklist and make sure everything is correct. The first thing would be in general preferences, there is a definition of what the export folder is. So you have to know that or create it, and make sure that when you go to bounce, because bounce is what actually triggers the WalkMix deliverable process, make sure they match. The second thing is
Right.
that,
Actually, let me just, so for clarity, just to re-emphasize that, is that when you're exporting from your workstation, no matter which one it is, wherever you're exporting the file needs to be the exact same place that this is set up here, so that the software recognizes where it is, and then what you're telling it to do, it's got the source file to work with.
yeah, it's the actual bounce and what the bounce creates that triggers the process.
Right.
Next thing is that the channel that has the plugin on it. Can you see my pointer?
Yes.
Okay. The channel that has the plugin on it must match the output of that channel must match the channel in the master fader, and it could be a stereo master fader. Most of the time, we use a stereo master fader. So that's
Actually, that's another point, and we talked about this last time, but just for refresher, is that the master fader within WalkMix, or I mean within whatever DAW you're using, does not need to be a 10 channel, 12 channel output bus for something like that. A stereo output will work just fine, a stereo fader.
And it's the simplest way. Yes.
Yeah.
And the third thing, and this is one that gets me all the time, the plugin must be showing and the power must be turned on. So that has to be green. If it's white, you won't get the export interface when the bounce is done. And then you would execute the bounce process. And again, in different workstations, it's called different things maybe, but pretty much these things relate to each other. And then check the settings in the bounce window. And again, this is Pro Tools, Nuendo is different, Logic is different, but they're the same sort of things. Like the source in this case needs to be needs to match the master fader. the mix source. The format is 24-bit, 48 kilohertz, interleaved. It's got to be set to that. The destination, as we pointed out before, it needs to match what is set up in general preferences. And we recommend an offline bounce. And I'm just going to try to share a different screen and see if I can kind of show an example of this. Okay. So can you see Pro Tools?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So this is my sample session here, and you can see it's made up of one 7.0, well, it's actually a 702 reverb channel, and lots of mono channels and a few stereo channels. The drums and percussion are kind of low, mini Moog low, synth bed, stuff like that down on the bottom. So this is a pretty big session. It's 61 objects. And I'm gonna let's do a bounce and see what happens. So bounce mix. Check everything.
Actually, Gus, you want to real quick? Do you want to go through the set before you hit bounce? Go through the settings if you're going to do a real time and show headphone profile if you're in that window, and make sure your destination is set so you show where the destination that you're about to bounce is, etc.
It's kind of difficult to get to those, but one thing, at least for the bounce, you need to make sure that the export destination is correct. And all of that other stuff you just mentioned doesn't matter for the bounce itself.
Right. I just thought maybe pulling up and showing where that dialogue was within the plugin might be helpful.
Sure, I can do that. So this is a speaker setting, 904 plus 2B, and the speaker routing is done in this area here. The headphone setting is a default profile right now, but in this case, you could put in other headphone profiles if you've had your measurement made. Okay. Anyway, let me run the bounce.
Thanks, Gus.
Sure. So bounce mix. And if everything is set up correctly, we've checked everything, the directory is correct. Once we bounce this, it should, you'll see the objects animated. You'd be hearing something too if speakers were on, so you might want to mute that. Once this is done and everything was set correctly, you will get the walk mix interface. It'll first start by scanning for peak levels, and you can choose to normalize or not. I'm going to say no. And
do you want to talk about why no?
Why no? Oh no, because I'm just doing this as a demonstration, not for something real. But
I was thinking more so. Maybe we'll get to it later. I was thinking more so about album consistency. If you've already,
that's another reason.
You wanted singles versus albums.
Yeah.
We can come back to that.
Yeah, true. So the bounce window came up, and in this window, normally people don't really pay attention to. By the way, the pre-render is a salmon wave. So these are the pre-render levels. You choose all of these levels, this is basically what you would choose to deliver to Sony. The 4 levels of MPEG-H, if you were delivering to a DSP, you would just choose that probably only. All right. Well, anyway, in here, you can also look at options, and we're going to cover these options later. But anyway, I just want to show you that this is what happens when you run the bounce. This interface comes up. And I'm going to cancel out of this and jump back.
Well, that did talk about static and dynamic objects at that spot.
Right.
You may want to come back to that.
Yeah, we will.
Okay.
Okay. So share this. Okay. So we hit the bounce, and that's where we were. So these choices are what Sony Music requires. The salmon wave are the pre-renders, 4 levels of pre-render, 13 channel speaker render, which is this setting here, the unprocessed export, which is basically an export of your entire session, all the objects that have gone through your plugins and levels and motion automation. All of that is included in the unprocessed, and the binaural headphone reference to listen to a standard hearing profile of what the project sounds like. Again, if you're sending directly to a DSP and not Sony, maybe they only want the MP4. Mike, do you have any information on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's accurate, right? I mean, for Sony Music, what's generally happening is you're giving us the pre-render packages are the most important thing for us, because then we'll create the MPEG-H encodes. And what's actually happening is we're registering in the full resolution pre-renders to a system, and then systemically transcoding and delivering to outlets those MPEG-H's. So if you are going direct, and I think even in the case of like Orchard Distribution, that kind of stuff, you would give them the MPEG-H assets directly, and that's what they're delivering to DSPs.
As far as delivering to Sony, do you have any advice on naming conventions? Is there a way to know how to do that?
I think Steven, were you prepared to show something? Are we ready for that, or?
Yeah, I've got it here ready. If you want me to share my screen, I can go ahead and share our deliverables guide.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's go right into that, because naming convention is huge.
Okay. Should I stop sharing, and or will Steve take over?
You need to stop for him to be able to share.
Got it. All right, Steven.
Awesome. Hey, everybody. Hang on just a second. Let me get my.
And by the way, the naming conventions were also shout out to the P&E wing is deliverables document forthcoming, updating things like naming conventions, folder hierarchy. First, the stereo one is being revised, coming out very shortly, and then second, following that up will be the immersive deliverables guide. And naming conventions is huge in there.
I'm sorry, guys. My permissions is turned off. I might have to reopen my Zoom here real quick.
Or can we get a document maybe attached to this session?
Not a problem. I can go ahead and drop that in the chat.
Okay, then we'll move on.
That's the link to the Sony page, the deliverables guideline page.
Exactly. Yeah.
Perfect. That's perfect.
Okay, I'm going to go back to my presentation. So when you when you set your export up, you want to choose all of these levels. Those were the levels we were talking about in the beginning, where these 5 channels, 10 channels, 16 channels, 24 channels, and these apply both to the pre-render, which is a salmon wave, and the final MP4. Although with Sony, you don't need to make the MP4, so that takes time, don't do it. When you run this export interface, you get the option to preview the default. When you hit the preview button, it will go through and it will do some AI on your session and come up with what objects should be dynamic and what should be static. And we'll get into that in a bit, because static objects, that's not quite the right terminology, but that's what it says in the application. So you can preview it, and if you want to change it, you can click the edit button. Then you can change what is a static or dynamic object assignment. It's not really a static object. Dynamic objects will all have their own streams. Objects that we designate as static really are being rendered in a static bed. And you have some choice over what that bed is. And in this example here, the static bed is 5-channel surround with 2 uppers. And that takes up 5, 6, 7 channels. Let's see. In this case, the source is 44 objects, and you're using 7 channels for the static bed, and 17 are left over. And these are things you can change. Excuse me. And with 17, you can choose what items are static and what items are dynamic. And there are a lot of things that come into play when you're making these choices? And some of them are how important the sound is. Some of them might be, do I need coverage in the lower areas? And here, Steven, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you're actually going in and changing the static configuration and the dynamic object priority, but more about the static configuration. What are your thoughts when you're working on a project? What do you go in and change, and why?
Totally. It's a little bit of a balancing act, right? You're taking a few different things into consideration when you're selecting your static object configuration. And also if you're manually selecting which of those objects are going to be dynamic or static. The main thing that you're thinking about really is in terms of your mix placement. So like a good example is like often in my mixes, I'm using a center channel because I want that extra bit of headroom. I also like the focus that it gives when I take objects, and like if I take a stereo pair, if I have a center that I generate from that stereo stem, then I can throw my objects a little bit wider while still retaining some degree of focus in the center. I find that a really effective mix technique, and I want that to be translated in all versions of my pre-renders. So I'm always going to be selecting, if I have objects like that in my mix, I'm going to be selecting a configuration that does include a static object in that center location, just because I'm using it very heavily there. Other things to consider on that front are also potential fold downs in the future, right? So if sometimes we do see mix engineers really max out their static bed count. So they're doing like one of the super high static object configurations. And, it's kind of like doing, like a bed-based mix in a lot of ways. And, that's an approach, and sometimes it translates really, really well. But one of the tricks with that is that, if you're down mixing in some specific version of that playback, you're going to lose a little bit of movement resolution in certain situations. So it might sound great on headphones, it might sound great in your like multi-channel space, but then maybe if that goes down to a soundbar, it might not be quite exactly the down mix that you had in mind. So you're kind of wrestling with all the different playback options that a consumer might encounter when you're selecting this. The other thing to consider as well is this dynamic object priority, which it's really just an AI engine that's been embedded that automatically selects dynamic and static objects. And it's a little bit convoluted and it's a little bit confusing, to be perfectly honest. There's not a lot of good documentation on it. And my advice always, when I'm talking to engineers that are messing with the dynamic object priority, is to just hit reanalyze. You see that reanalyze button in the upper right-hand corner. If you change your dynamic object priority and hit reanalyze, it'll basically rescan and you'll be able to see all the changes from the dynamic to the static objects. But the basic rules of thumb is that modes 3 and 4 tend to take into account pairs of objects. So if you have, a stereo stem that's in your walk mix, it will be, pairing that off. So if, it'll attempt at least to, if it has available dynamic objects, to make, your left and right of that stem a dynamic object. It won't just pick one or the other. And then generally speaking, modes 1 and 2 don't do that quite as much. It seems like modes 1 and 3 tend to take into account level a bit more than movement. So like a good example is like when I did a mix recently, I was kind of scanning through the different object priorities, and I noticed that mode 3 was locked in on my lead vocal, which is a static object, or not a static object in the sense of like it's part of the bed, but it doesn't move in the context of my mix. It's an object that doesn't move. So I noticed that mode 3 marked those as dynamic objects. But mode 4 did not, because they're the loudest thing in my mix, but they don't have movement to them. So a good rule of thumb, you're welcome to mess around with dynamic object priority, but my recommendation is always to hit reanalyze every time you change it and see what's different and make a decision. Personally, I find that leaving, objects as dynamic, it does a few things. I think it adds a degree of focus on a binaural representation of that mix. And then the other thing that I think it does is it kind of plays ball with this approach to mixing, which is an object-based approach. And so you're looking towards the future, and you're looking towards, future configurations where this might be folding down in a car stereo, and it'll fold down properly with, movement on playback as opposed to movement that's baked into individual channels. So you're kind of also playing ball with like this approach to mixing, this new object-based approach to mixing. But we see it all the time that people take a much more channel-based approach, and that can be really successful too. It's totally a project by project thing. And ultimately, as an engineer, the thing that sounds the best is the thing that you should roll with. So I tell folks to kind of trust their gut on that one.
Or a song by song thing.
Yeah, song by song, project by project. It could be.
Great.
Right.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Indeed.
And let's see. So I'm going to go through some examples, graphic examples. This is that 61 object mix that I showed you before. This is the level 3 export. 553 is chosen. So that basically, that is the 360 format. So the static object bed will be made up of 13 channels, this configuration. And then you can go in here, you can make those choices yourself, or you could reanalyze, and it will make them for you. What's going on here? Again, I showed you the source. Let's take a look at the destination. I need to sorry, let me share a different page.
All right.
So this actually is that pre-render brought into another workstation. And this is the result of the choices that were made. That was that bed, that static object bed, that's presented here with the white balls. That's the 5 and the ear level, 5 and 3 on the bottom. The rest are dynamic objects. And dynamic and static has nothing to do with whether it's moving or not. It means, is it in the dynamic bed? I'm sorry, the static bed, or is it a dynamic object that is its own stream coming to the smart device? So I hope that kind of clears things up a little bit there. And
Great.
oh, get out of here. Okay. Sorry, I'm sharing the wrong thing here.
While you do that real quick, hey, Mike, let's answer a question from Tom Ammerman. I think you hit it, but just to follow up while Gus is pulling it up in the Q&A, is the pre-render finally a straightforward channel-based mix?
Yeah, I'm not really, no, right? I mean, this is object-based mixing, right? So I think the idea is that the pre-render, and I'm not a huge fan of walk mix calling them levels, because the MPEG-H also has levels. It gets confusing.
Right.
We tend to reference them by object count, so you've got a 5, 10, 16, 24 object. And really what's happening is it's in that pre-render process is taking your objects, and the whole conversation we just had is dynamic versus static, kind of assigning objects based on the mix and your preferences in terms of, whether they're static and associated with an object or within a channel, kind of based on that static object configuration that's noted, or dynamic, meaning something that's moving around, right? And that all plays into I guess the algorithm that's used to virtualize the 360 space, right? Because the idea is you're mixing, you're that little head in the center of that sphere, and your objects are all around you. That's like the kind of virtualization of where you're listening to, and that sound is coming from within that 360 field. And then they're using HRTF, technology to kind of translate that into how an average person hears, right? Or with custom HRTF, how you as an individual may hear in a specific space where your HRTF has been measured. So it's really definitely not straightforward channel based. It's That would be kind of an oversimplification.
His thank you. His follow-up question on that real quick was, so then the result is channel based, correct? So the result is channels.
I mean, as an individual listening to it out of a playback mechanism, yeah, you're listening to speakers, right? But how it's translated, there's a number of things that determine how it's translated. What object are you listening to in the end? How many channels that algorithm is translating it to? An Amazon Echo Studio device, or two paired together, or more, or a sound bar, or any variation of thing. I mean, and I think that's what makes this technology a little bit more complicated. Is that as a mix engineer trying to, I mean, before with stereo, you had your NS10s, you had maybe your Genelecs, whatever you got in your studio, and you get a good approximation of how everyone's listening to it. It's significantly more of a challenge.
Yeah.
Cool.
And the binaural reference, the standard hearing profile, that's like the Oratones. That's what a lot of people are going to be hearing, and you have to make sure it works on there. But I just wanted to mention also, these are some of the choices of the object bed. It could be as little as 2 channels. So let's say you had a 24-track tape and you just wanted everything to be an object, or you would at least be able to make 22 objects and 1 stereo bed. So it could be mostly objects that get to the smartphone, depending on what your music is. If you had less than 24, they're all objects. They can all be objects.
At the fullest resolution, right?
Right. Well, it's right.
Yeah, and Gus, this kind of ties into a question that Justin Gray looks like he posted to the Q&A section, which is that for larger object counts where sources are using the whole space, can you see a disadvantage to leaving everything on dynamic? And I mean, to answer that question, for certain projects that can sound great. It really can. The one disadvantage really is that ultimately, if you have a 60 object count project, you're going to need to do some static objects, because otherwise you'll run out of available objects for even a 24 object pre-render. And then he has a part 2 of the question, which is that if numerous objects are in the same location, let's say LCR, it would likely make sense for them to share a static bed to reduce the number of objects that need to be summed down in that pre-render. Do you agree with that? I would say, yeah, we see that all the time. That's definitely a technique that people use in order to reserve their dynamic objects for maybe some really interesting piece of movement in their mix. Especially when you're thinking about that, you're also thinking about maybe your 10 object pre-render, where it's you're really maybe pinching pennies to, if you've got a moment in your mix that you really want to shine, you might be making some decisions that, are you're summing things down. You might take your lead vocals and push them back into the static object bed to allow for that really interesting bit of automation to really shine through. So we see all kinds of things from different engineers, and it's kind of a matter of taste and kind of a project to project, song to song call. But yeah.
Yep.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Steven. That's kind of what Mike said earlier. If it sounds good, do it. If it doesn't, don't.
Right. So yeah, and here I'm just showing the different levels and the result. This is the 10 object or a 10 static object bed, where everything is going into the static bed. And then of course, the first level 0.5, it's just 5 channels. And the default for that is 5-channel surround. But if you wanted to do something like 2-channel bed and have the rears be like your back quad and something up in the ceiling, you could do that even with that. So then the next deliverable that is requested is the unprocessed. And what the unprocessed deliverable is, basically it's everything in the session that has gone through your plugins. It is the final mix, all the objects, all the level automation, motion automation, positions, and that also exists of a .sam, which is the metadata that explains what to do with all the WAV files. And the WAV files are the original captures from the export process. Recently, ADM and master ADM have been added to the export function. And what master ADM is this entire thing here, the unprocessed export plus any decisions that you've made in the pre-render area. So if you've come up with custom designations, that information will be in the master ADM. The ADM, on the other hand, is just an ADM format version of the 4 pre-renders. So if you click ADM and you have the 4 pre-renders set, you'll get 4 ADMs, and each of them will match the pre-render levels.
That's right. So again, the clarification, the difference between the two is that the ADM does not include the unprocessed export. Right. The master ADM does. A quick question for for Michael and Steven. Do you guys see a timeline where the ADM will be the or the master ADM will be the accepted deliverable period?
We're super excited about it. It's been a long time coming, I think. But at this point, it's kind of in the hands of DSPs, right? So the partners that we're dealing with that accept 360 RA, they're currently set up for receiving the MPEG-H files we've been sending them. And actually, on the flip side of that one is, where we are is we're for other formats where there is an ADM that's accepted, that's what's being delivered to DSPs, and they're doing the encodes on their side, right, for their platforms, for various reasons. We want to get there with 360 RA as well. So part of that is the DSP's ability to accept an ADM. The second part of that is actually Sony's encoder for ADM, taking the ADM and making the MPEG-H, which is, I think, still in development, probably near ready. Gus could probably answer that better, but we're waiting on that, in correlation with the partners being able to accept them as well.
Awesome. So fairly soon, it sounds like it's in process. It's being the process is being developed, accelerated, focused on, goal oriented to make that happen. Great.
Correct. Yep.
Awesome. I think that's going to be a big help when that becomes easily a deliverable that's understood by folks.
Oh yeah.
And inclusive, like it's got all your parts and pieces in it, just like the, another ADM that allows you to create everything you need from it.
Yeah, I'm sure anyone that's probably on this call right now that's been mixing in 360 RA and provisioning deliverables is spending a good deal of their time organizing files and naming things, and this will help reduce the number of naming files that you have to do.
Right.
So.
Yeah. I'll just say that file management is not why I got into audio. Right?
Exactly.
Anyway, so going on, I mentioned this already, the 13-channel speaker render, where each file is the signal that would be going to a speaker. And I guess that's an archival reason for that deliverable, right, Mike?
Yeah, it's to future-proof the format to an extent. So if there's like a Planet of the Apes situation where 200 years from now someone digs up a vault with these files in it, they'll be able to see the coordinates where these things
have a channel-based
even if they
playback.
don't have walk mix,
Yeah. I mean, it's the unprocessed and the 13-channel output really are. This is an evolving technology. We don't know where it's going to go. The assumption is that people are mixing 360 RA in the recommended 13-channel environment. So we do want to get a channel-based output of what the mix engineer heard and approved, right? And in a situation where maybe it's deprecated or something in the future, we'll be able to leverage this as kind of like a static 13-channel kind of representation of the mix. Unprocessed is a similar situation. We don't know, like we're moving to ADM Wave. What do we do with all these pre-render packages that we've been archiving, storing, and leveraging as our main master source? How do we turn them into ADMs? Like we wanted to kind of future-proof it, and that's why we're asking for these things.
Cool.
Yeah.
If folks want to, and if just as a refresher, maybe to folks that haven't been on earlier, if you look at what Gus has on the screen here, the pre-render, so you can tell the angle and elevations and where those are supposed to be just by the naming convention of those different.
Right, and that's new in the new version. It wasn't laid out that way before. So 0 would be front center, plus 30 would be left, 30 degrees, etc.
And mid, upper, bottom.
B means bottom. Correct. And Mike, is the headphone channel part of the deliverable, or is that just on demand?
We ask for it. I think we don't always get what we ask for.
Yeah.
So I think in instances where it's not provisioned, it's not a huge deal.
Okay.
But we do ask for it. Yeah.
So moving on to quality control, we touched on this in the last session, but WalkMix now comes with a player. It can be found in the applications folder, and you have to find that and run it from there. It will actually play all of the levels of salmon wave and all of the levels of MPEG-H. It can even play the unprocessed export, so that large file, it'll play that large file, and it will also play the ADMs that we're exporting now. Although we can't do anything with the ADMs right now, but it's coming. And it also supports the same playback hardware, your system in the studio that WalkMix is set up for, so it can play out of the 13-channel speakers, or if you're set up for 704, whatever you're set up for, it can address that. And it can also address custom hearing profiles in headphones. So if you have a hearing profile, you can load it into the player and listen that way instead of that using the standard hearing profile. And just quickly moving on to what we need to do to get an artist approval. In my opinion, the best way is to bring them into your studio and play them on your speakers. Play, that is the mix. Play the mix on your speakers. There are places and most of the major music centers that can be booked to do this. Short of that, you can output the binaural output for the artist as a WAV file, as a stereo WAV file, and it would be encoded with the standard hearing binaural profile. Having said that, if you have the artist's profile and they've been measured in one of these places that can do it, you could load that in and export the WAV file with their profile, and they get a much better experience.
The one piece of worthy of note there with that is if you do that for an artist and then that artist wants to share that with their engineer, they got to know that it's the wrong profile, that the profile is embedded in that.
That's true. That's absolutely true. They have to know it's their profile and don't share it with anyone.
It's awesome and also cautionary.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. And this is sorry. Artist Connection is a way to upload the MPEG-H files and stream them just as they would be streamed to any of these consumer devices. You would have to have an account with StreamSoft, and there's a link on the bottom there that you can get more information on. But you can create an album, songs, make a QR code, send the QR code to the artist. They don't have to have an account. They just click on the QR code and they can play that reference on their smartphone or whatever. Yeah, it would be their smartphone.
Yeah.
And additionally, if they have used their smartphone to measure their own hearing profile, take a picture, send it to the cloud, you get back something that closely approximates the way you hear 3D. That's an even better experience. So that's a great way to get artist approval and with some degree of customization. And I think I'm ready for questions.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Gus. Yeah, great stuff, guys. So let's get to some questions here. And I know we'll probably run off. So if anybody, we've got about 15 minutes. If anybody has additional questions, please go ahead and type them into the Q&A. Justin had asked earlier, do the MPEG-H assets then mirror exactly what you create at Sony using the pre-renders for level, well, he says 0, but I think 0.5, 1, 2, 3.
I can.
In other words, are your MPEG-H's the same as the ones we would WalkMix?
That's the question.
Oh yes, they're exactly what you'd see on the output of WalkMix. The one caveat that I would say that I do want to clear up that's slightly related to this is just similar to what Mike C was saying earlier, is that the levels on MPEG-H slightly different from the levels that you see as pre-render packages, because you could have, in 90% of cases, if you have more than 24 objects, you're going to see a one-to-one relationship between L0, L0, L1, L1. But in situations where you have fewer than 24 objects, you're going to see situations where you're getting, maybe a 16 object encode, but you're getting the L3, highest resolution lossy compression. So that's just something to be aware of.
But if they export the MPEG-H, that's
Yes.
doing the same thing you would be doing.
It would be doing the exact same thing that we'd be doing. Yes.
Yeah, creating all 4 levels of the MPEG-H. Yep.
Great.
It is mainly a terminology problem.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, guys. Say answer live and done. Okay, Eddie. Eddie asks, I see in Gus's mix that he has effects. All I ever receive from clients are instrument wave files. How are effects used in the Sphere or the rendering process?
Well, you can actually send to aux buses and put plugins on your aux buses. They could be effects. A lot of people, their effects are objects. You can have live effects as objects. It's very easy.
And the objects can be multi-channel, so you could have a
multi-channel
7.1 reverb as a destination as an effect.
Well, that 702 reverb in that example was a 702 channel, and when you bring it into WalkMix, it comes up in that configuration automatically, and that could be a reverb on an aux or something, and that's what it was actually.
Right. It's nice that the objects can be, you're not limited to mono or stereo. It can be any combination that you need for this very reason.
Yep.
Again, I guess that would be something as best practices as checking the rendering to make sure that they are, all parts of that are in the same static dynamic status.
And again, different possibilities with different workstations.
Right. Exactly. Cool. Thanks, guys. Next question again from Justin. The headphone channel is an interesting deliverable as it is not a direct representation of any of the consumer levels, correct? Can you describe what exactly it is and what it represents? The headphone.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Well, it represents a binaural representation of the unprocessed export.
So a 2-channel with localizable fold down.
Yes.
3-dimensional localizable.
Yes, and the accurate way to deliver something would be to go through Artist Connection, where they actually have the level 3 stream, the level 0.5 stream, and have those to listen to.
Artist Connection, by the way, awesome and great. And if folks don't know that, that's also that's John Reichbach, who was Sonic Solutions, Sonic Studio, and in conjunction with Andy Moore, we're working on that playback engine, and so it'll play back what you throw at it and bit for bit, which is awesome as a reference tool for artists.
Right.
Yeah.
And they can compare the standard mixes with the immersive mixes with the same tool.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which is useful. And Steven, we were talking the other day about matching the exact timing, and can you speak to that?
I mean, yeah, totally. From my position at Sony, we see pretty much every 360 asset come in, and the thing that holds up deadlines a lot of the time is that stuff is not aligned with the stereo ref. These deliverables get delivered in conjunction with their stereo counterparts, and the DSPs have told us that it's part of their specification that if possible these should be matching. Obviously there are some kind of special extenuating circumstances where they don't match, where it's like you've got the where we've done an upmix, or excuse me, not an upmix, but we've leveraged a quadraphonic recording from the 70s that's an entirely different mix from the stereo version, but those are very rare. 9 times out of 10 these DSPs want perfect alignment with the stereo ref, and so it's part of our process to check that. And so when you're crossing your T's and dotting your I's in this final export process, just really make sure that you're aligned with that stereo ref, because It's a bummer when we see stuff miss a delivery date or just barely eke in right under the gun. You know, just double check to make sure that stuff is aligned. It can be a little bit tricky with frontline material where, you know, stuff is getting done simultaneously, and then it just becomes a communication thing. You really want to make sure that when you're, you know, chatting with your clients, you know, that you've really got that final last version of the master, because we've all seen situations where there's some 11th hour change to something, or the last second gets spaced a little bit differently, or, you know, changed a little bit in this way or that way. So just be ultra sure that you're really dealing with that like final last approved stereo ref when you're doing this last export. So those are kind of the two things to watch out for, I think.
And at times, so there's also there's a handful of things to unwrap in that too, because it weighs, if somebody sees the opportunity, let's say legacy or something that's been out, hey, there was this cool guitar solo that we used to use, but we didn't for the single aspect, and the stereo doesn't have it. But hey, now that we're doing this, let's get that solo in there, that awesome 12th verse, you know, or something like that. That then a new stereo mix needs to be made that reflects that, so that they are similar in content. The other thing too to pay attention to, and and again back to the legacy work, is that a lot of times, you know, if something is being taken off, that if it was originally recorded on tape, let's say 2-inch tape, goes to 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch in the mix or even the mastering phase, you know, and VSO comes into play, and somebody's taking liberties with adjusting pitch and timing, is that, you know, those are considerations when trying to match the stereo track. I will say that it comes, you know, when things like that come to me, it's very, there's not much that can be done at the mastering stage to adjust the timing. It needs to happen in the mix. If you're going to stretch or compress the audio, it has to be before the mix, because any of the positional metadata gets thrown out the window and doesn't line up as it's supposed to. If you start or in a mastering stage starts messing with the length of the file, it throws things off. So it needs to be paid attention to in the mix stage to start the process of aligning the stereo files.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We definitely run into situations where we're having to kind of go back and do surgery on a mix to make sure that the automation stays exactly where it should when we're re-exporting. So just, yeah, make sure that you're just double checking that.
Yeah, cool. Justin finished up the question, and he answered his own question here too, but actually does bring up one, Gus. Does is there a plan that the WalkMix player would ever just be a standalone, whether mobile or non-mobile app?
We've asked for it. And what they keep pointing out is, look at the shape of it. It's you know, the
It
user
looks like a phone screen, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, there is a chance. Absolutely.
Okay. High probability, one might say. Okay, cool. Let's see. Eddie asks, did you discuss naming conventions? Stephen, do you want to touch on that for a minute? Do you want to just like hit a quick example?
I can, yeah. Actually, Gus, if it's possible, would you be able to, because I still don't have permission up to be able to share my screen on this computer, but if you wouldn't mind pulling up the submission guidelines, I can.
I don't know where to find them.
Oh, they're in the chat section.
I think I might be able to do it.
Okay. And while you're doing that, Justin hit on the question I was waiting for pretty much the whole time, like who was going to ask it, but loudness. Deliverable levels. We talked about that in our prep call and all. Does anybody, you guys want to address current and future?
Yeah, absolutely. So the current situation, and this is reflective of the fact that for a long time there was no ability to measure LKFS level. And then in the recent build in October, I believe,
the 1.4 version,
we had the add of the LUFS meter in WalkMix. And so I think we can expect to see a loudness target enter the picture in the coming months. But until then, the general advice that we give is that ultimately this is a format that was based around the idea of peak level and headroom more than anything else. So you're dealing with a situation where your max peak level is going to be 0 dBFS per 13 channels in the standard 13.0 channel mix configuration for this format. How that translates to loudness, we do see a pretty wide range of loudness. To be perfectly frank, we definitely see stuff that comes in at about Atmos levels, but there is also a lot of competitive material that comes in hotter than that from especially the frontline labels. And when I'm chatting with engineers, it feels prudent to mention that, because we want to make sure that, you know, engineers are not getting blindsided by that. So generally, people are mixing a little bit hotter than Atmos for this format, but we definitely do see still stuff, you know, kind of sitting around Atmos levels as well.
Well, it seems like to me, so just to follow that for a second, is if the DSPs are doing, the distributors are doing, you know, gain matching, auto leveling, et cetera, across a body of work, like an album versus singles, that matching similar looking at Atmos levels, as you're saying, would be the safe way and the best way to get the most out of it, because then you've got headroom, and if it can go up, then it'll turn it up, but it won't turn it down because they're too loud.
Exactly. Yeah. There's also a risk of, if you push louder than 0 dBFS peak, especially if you're like regularly doing that in your mix, you know, to the point that you're, dBFS, if you're over 0 dBFS peak in your mix and you're regularly hitting over that 0 point, you're also risking, you know, not only normalization, but potential distortions on playback in certain hardware devices, and also DSPs, and also additional limiting too.
Right. One thing of note too is that the headphone output is -6 dB. So if you're referencing on a headphone output versus speaker output or other things, to know that that has been gained down for that reason.
Exactly. I also think it's prudent, if you're getting this approved by clients, to let them know that in advance, that there's automatic attenuation built into the binaural output, because you know, often we'll get feedback. The first bit of feedback that we get from clients is like, why is it quiet? And it's like, this is an inherently quieter format, especially in the binaural side of things.
Great. I see another question. I'm going to hit that. I know we're running out of time, but let's talk about the naming convention real quick while I grok Dave's question here.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing to note is that if you look at our deliverables guidelines, the unfortunate thing is that it looks nothing like the walk mix output. Unfortunately, the walk mix output is kind of a track by track approach. And what we ask for is each individual category of deliverable sorted into its own individual folder. So you have a headphone folder, you have a pre-renders folder, you have a stereo ref folder. We really appreciate it if you reorganize these before sending them to us, because it makes our life a heck of a lot easier, and it makes our job in terms of turning this stuff out and getting stuff in under deadline a lot easier. I find the search function in the Finder window to be really helpful in quickly reorganizing this stuff. You can like very quickly search for all your, like, say L1 pre-renders and drop them all into a folder at once. So we've gotten pretty quick at it over here, but if you do it on your end, you make us happy. In terms of naming specifically, the most critical thing is track number. More than anything else, we too often get every track without a track number at the top of the track. If you have an ISRC available, if you've received an ISRC from the label, that's really helpful too. But if you don't, that's perfectly fine. But it is included in our deliverables guideline. But obviously, if you don't have a product number or an ISRC, that's okay. The critical thing in terms of file naming is really the track number. And then ideally, it should be sorted into individual subfolders per category and then per track within that. So if you go to like a pre-renders folder, that will open up, and then you'll see, you know, or here you can see on the screen, we're looking at the 13.1 offline renders or the speaker renders. And then within that, you see tracks 1, 2, et cetera. And then within those folders, you see each individual speaker render. So that's the ideal way we like to receive our deliverables. And in terms of track naming, it's just really helpful to have that track number in there.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, until we get to the ADM deliverable. But yeah, this is file management, and it does help a lot to make sure everything is organized very properly. It does speed the process along. Track numbers. Yeah, don't forget the track numbers. That's kind of basic.
It is, but it
Yeah,
happens.
but I imagine you see everything, I'm sure, and the deliverables. It's
Well,
like,
and when labels are in a hurry to get something out, you know,
right.
everyone's on the same team here. We're all trying to get something out, you know, quickly, on time, in the way that the artist wants it to be. So, you know, sometimes sometimes the details go out the window.
Days gone by when somebody would come to me and say, "Hey, here's a bag of DATs. My record is in here. Do this." And you're like, "Oh man, it's not even labeled. I don't even know where things are."
Exactly.
Hey, Dave, one last thing. So Dave asked a question about the timing. So do you want to talk about that real quick? Like what happens if you see something that comes in, like let's say that there's a song, the timing of the file, the stereo and the original, or the timing and the 360 are exactly the same, but, you know, beats within have drifted over, you know, in and out a little bit. You've made it, you know, the engineer has made it match. However, it may not be spot on when clicking back and forth between. Do you care about that as long as it matches the length?
We do not care. In terms of tape drift, you know, we've explained to the DSPs that there are certain things that we just can't change about analog recording. So it's, you know, the important thing is that when we run into something like this, we're going to note that there's tape drift on this master, and that, you know, if we get pushback from the DSPs, we'll have a reason to say this should still proceed to market. So that's the important thing that we need. So if you run into a situation like that, or if you catch it, it's actually really helpful if you just include a note with your master that says, "Hey, there's tape drift on this. Please proceed as is." So that way we just know, you know, hey, you know, got the alignment as close as you could, which is great. But you know, there's nothing to be done about, you know, we can't go back to 1975 and with a couple of laptops and re-record this, you know, so.
Right. Hey, that's like, you know, one last great point is that include a note when you're delivering. If there's anything worthy of note, include that so you know that it's intentional. You know, if it's going to be that there's meant to be a crossfade and the song can't crossfade because, you know, for whatever reason, or frames to milliseconds, or if it's just super close, you know, include that. Have a note for you guys. So when you see that, you know that it's been approved and it's intentional, no matter what. I think that's a good best practice as well. I think with that, we're out of time and we're out of questions. Gus, Michael, Steven, thank you guys very much. Let's bring on Maureen. Appreciate you guys being a part of this.
Thank you. I learned a lot today.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome.
So much.
Maureen, welcome back, Maureen.
No, fascinating. So much good information. Thank you guys for sharing all this and for the good questions. We're going to have one more segment coming from our friends here at Sony 360, and we'll be in touch about the date. We haven't quite settled on the date yet, with being where we are in the holiday year and all of that, but it'll be very soon and we'll let you know. So thanks everybody who is on the screen, everybody who provided all the information today, and thanks everybody who attended. It's great to see your names in the Q&A and in the participants. Thank you. See you next time.
Thanks, everybody.